My husband laughed when the attorney slid the folder across the table. He said the only thing I'd inherit from a woman who darned her own socks and clipped coupons was a box of mothballs and a leaking roof. He leaned back in the leather chair like he owned the room, so certain, so amused. What he didn't know was that there were 2 wills inside that folder, and only one of them had his name in it. My name is Raven. I'm 37 years old and I am a forensic accountant in Boston, which means I have spent my entire career finding the money that people swear isn't there. This was the second Tuesday of November at 2:15 in the afternoon, in a 10th floor conference room with windows that looked out over a gray and restless harbor. My grandmother, Vivienne, had been gone for 11 days. The room smelled of furniture polish and the faint bitterness of the coffee no one had touched. My husband Marcus sat to my right, in a suit he'd bought specifically for this meeting, already mentally spending an inheritance he assumed was coming to him through me. He had checked his watch 4 times before the attorney even sat down. What he didn't understand, what almost no one understood about my grandmother, was that the woman who darned her own socks had spent 60 years making sure nobody would ever take anything from her family by force, charm, or contempt. But before I tell you what the attorney read out loud that afternoon, and what happened to the color in my husband's face when he reached the 3rd page, you need to come back with me to a kitchen in Vermont, 22 years ago, where a woman with flour on her hands first taught me how to watch people without letting them know they were being watched. Before I go on, if this story is starting to settle into your chest the way it settled into mine, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you genuinely feel something, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing who's sitting on the other side of the screen tonight. Now let me take you back to that kitchen. Grandma Vivienne raised me in a narrow farmhouse outside Montpelier after my parents' marriage came apart, and neither of them wanted the inconvenience of a quiet, watchful 8-year-old. The house was always a little cold in the mornings, and it smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon and the lavender she kept in a chipped bowl by the door. She had been widowed at 41 and never remarried, and she ran her small life with a precision that people mistook for stinginess. She wore the same wool coat for 15 winters. She drove a brown sedan with 210,000 miles on it, and she never, not once, let anyone see the full shape of what she had. What people saw was a thrifty old woman. What I saw, because I lived with her, was something else entirely. I saw the locked drawer in the rolled-top desk that she opened only at night. I saw the monthly envelopes that arrived from a bank in Burlington and a brokerage in New York. Envelopes she opened with a letter knife and read twice before locking away. I saw her sit at the kitchen table on the first Sunday of every month with a ledger and a sharpened pencil, and I saw the columns of numbers that did not match the life she pretended to live. She caught me watching once, when I was 11. She didn't scold me. She just smiled and said, "Good. Always look at what people do with their money, Raven. It tells you the truth they'd never say out loud." There was one afternoon I have never forgotten. I was 13, and a man came to the door, a cousin of hers, smooth and warm, who needed a loan he swore he'd repay by spring. She made him tea. She listened to every word. And when he left empty-handed but still smiling, she turned to me and said something I didn't understand for another 20 years. She said, "The ones who laugh at what you've earned are the ones already planning how to take it." I thought she was being bitter. I know now she was teaching me how to survive. I was the only one who sat with her in the hospital those final weeks. My mother sent a card. My uncle sent flowers and a question, relayed through the nurse, about whether the farmhouse had been appraised yet. I held her hand and read to her from the gardening catalogs she loved, and 3 days before she died, she pressed a small brass key into my palm and closed my fingers over it. "When the day comes," she whispered, "let them say everything they're going to say first. Let them show you who they are. Then open the second folder." I didn't know what she meant. I tucked the key into my coat pocket and forgot about it in the fog of grief. Marcus and I had been married for 6 years by then. I'd met him at a conference in Chicago when I was 31. Charming, quick, the kind of man who made a waiter feel like the most important person in the room, and then forgot his name the moment the check arrived. For a long time, I told myself that warmth was real. It took me years to understand that charm and kindness are not the same thing, and that a man can be generous with strangers and merciless with the woman who shares his bed. The cruelty was never loud. That's what made it hard to name. It lived in small remarks delivered with a smile. When I made senior associate at my firm, he told our friends I'd been lucky with the timing. When I bought my grandmother a new winter coat with my own bonus, he asked why I was throwing good money at a woman who'd never spend a dime on herself. And when Vivienne died, before her body was even released to the funeral home, he sat across from me at our own kitchen table, scrolling real estate listings, and said, "That land's got to be worth something. Finally, that tightwad's good for one thing." I didn't say anything. I counted the seconds. I remember it was 9, and I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, a quiet one, the kind my grandmother would have recognized. In the days that followed, Marcus's true expectations came into focus with almost surgical clarity. He told his mother, Constance, that we'd be set once the estate cleared. Constance, who had never liked me and never bothered to hide it, called me twice that week to suggest sweetly that since Marcus had supported me emotionally through the loss, it was only fair the inheritance be treated as marital property. She used the word fair the way some people use a knife. I listened. I said very little, and every night, after Marcus fell asleep certain that a windfall was on its way, I lay awake, turning that small brass key over in my fingers, finally beginning to understand what my grandmother had set in motion. Because here is what I had quietly learned in the weeks before that conference room. 3 years earlier, my grandmother had retained a new attorney, a careful, soft-spoken man named Edward Lockhart, whose firm handled estates the way surgeons handle hearts. She had told no one. She had drafted a new will, signed and notarized on March 9th, and she had instructed Mr. Lockhart to keep the existence of the second document sealed until the family had gathered and the first will had been read aloud. The brass key opened a deposit box at the Burlington Bank, the box where the originals were kept. My grandmother had not just left me money. She had left me a sequence, a choreography, a way of letting the people around me reveal themselves before the truth landed. If you've ever loved someone the world dismissed as small and quiet, and known they were the strongest person in the room, type the word Vivienne in the comments. I read every single one. I did what she asked. I let it unfold. I called the family meeting myself, the proper reading of the will, and I made sure Marcus and Constance were both there. I dressed plainly. I said almost nothing in the weeks leading up to it. And when Marcus asked, the night before, whether I'd found out the number yet, I told him the truth, that I hadn't seen the will. He smirked and patted my hand and told me not to get my hopes up, because women like my grandmother talked big and died poor. The first will was read at 2:15. It was the older document, the public one, dated 6 years earlier, and it was exactly what my grandmother had wanted them to hear. The farmhouse, with its leaking roof and its 2 acres of frost-bitten land, was left to me. A box of personal effects, photographs, her ledgers, the lavender bowl, was left to me. A modest savings account of $11,000 was to be divided among the surviving relatives. That was all the first will said. And that was the moment Marcus laughed. He didn't bother to hide it. He laughed out loud in a room full of grieving people, leaned back, and made his comment about mothballs and the mortgage. Constance pressed a tissue to her mouth to cover a smile. My uncle muttered that the old woman had wasted everyone's afternoon. And Marcus turned to me, eyes bright with the particular meanness of a man who feels vindicated, and said, loud enough for the whole table, I told you. All that ledger scribbling, and she leaves you a tear-down and a box of junk. Well, at least we got dressed up. I let him say it. I let all of them say it. I folded my hands on the cool surface of the table, and I watched, the way my grandmother taught me to watch, while every person in that room showed me exactly who they were. And then I looked at Edward Lockhart, and I gave him the smallest nod. I need to pause here for a moment. If you can feel what I was feeling right then, not rage, not triumph, just that strange and total calm that comes over you when you finally stop hoping a person will be better than they are. Type the words, "I understand," in the comments. Then stay with me, because this is where it turned. Mr. Lockhart cleared his throat and said, in his quiet way, that there was a second document. The room went still. He explained that the will just read had been superseded, revoked in legal terms, by a later instrument executed on March 9th, 3 years prior, properly witnessed and notarized, held in sealed trust at his firm's instruction. He removed a second folder from his briefcase, the twin of the first, and he opened it. The afternoon light through the harbor windows had gone the color of pewter. Somewhere down the hall, a phone was ringing, and no one answered it. Marcus had stopped smiling. What the second will established, Mr. Lockhart read, was a trust. My grandmother, the woman who darned her own socks, had over 60 years quietly built an estate that, between the brokerage accounts, 2 commercial properties in Burlington she had purchased in the 1980s, and the land beneath the farmhouse that a developer had been trying to buy for years, was valued at $3,400,000. I watched the number land on Marcus. I watched it go in. The color drained from his face the way water drains from a cracked glass, all at once and from the bottom up. But it was the conditions that did the real work. The trust was left entirely to me, Mr. Lockhart read, to be held as my sole and separate property, explicitly excluded from any marital estate, administered by an independent trustee, with no spouse and no in-law holding any claim, present or future, to a single dollar of it. My grandmother had written that clause herself, in her own careful language, and Mr. Lockhart read it aloud word for word. Constance made a small sound. Marcus leaned forward and said the appraisal had to be wrong, that there was no way, that the old woman drove a brown sedan for God's sake. And then Mr. Lockhart turned to the last page, and he said there was a letter. My grandmother had asked that it be read aloud only if certain people were present. He looked at Marcus over the top of his glasses, and he read it. In the letter, my grandmother wrote that she had met Marcus exactly 4 times. She wrote that on the second occasion, at Thanksgiving 5 years earlier, he had pulled her aside in her own kitchen and asked her, quietly, charmingly, whether she had made arrangements for me, and whether those arrangements might be structured to benefit the household. She had smiled and said nothing, but she had written it down that night in her ledger, with the date, the way she wrote down everything. And she had decided then and there that the man who counted her money before she was cold would never touch a cent of it. This was the receipt. Mr. Lockhart produced a photocopied page from her ledger, dated November 24th, in her unmistakable slanted hand. A single line recording what Marcus had asked her, and beside it, 3 words. Watch this one. The room was so silent I could hear the radiator tick. Marcus's hands had started to tremble against the table, and he pressed them flat to make them stop. Constance would not look at me. I sat very still, and I thought of a 13-year-old girl in a cold Vermont kitchen, and a cousin who left empty-handed, and a woman with flour on her hands, who said the ones who laugh at what you've earned are already planning how to take it. I understood her now, completely. I looked across the table at the man I had married, who had laughed at a box of mothballs 90 seconds before, and I did not gloat, and I did not shout. I simply said, "She always told me to let people finish talking first." And then I let the silence do the rest, because the silence said everything that I no longer needed to. Marcus tried, in the days that followed, to find a door that wasn't sealed. He called 3 attorneys. Each one told him the same thing, that the trust was airtight, separate, untouchable, drafted by a man who built such things for a living. He tried tenderness next, which was almost worse to watch. He came home with flowers, the first in years, and talked about how we would manage our good fortune. And I understood, at last, that the warmth I'd fallen for had always been a tool, brought out only when something could be gained. Constance stopped returning to the word fair. She started using the word family instead, which, in her mouth, meant the same thing. I did not celebrate. That isn't who Vivienne raised. But I did make decisions, calmly and in order, the way she would have. I filed for divorce on the 1st of December. My cousin, the developer's offer still standing, I declined. And I kept the farmhouse with its leaking roof, because some things are not for sale. And when my uncle called, weeks later, with a quiet and genuine apology for the way he'd spoken at the reading, I accepted it, because he was the only one who ever offered one without a hand held out behind it. I told him the door was open. I did not tell him the others were sealed. He understood. There is a morning I think about now. It was late January, and I was sitting in my grandmother's kitchen, my kitchen now, with the wood stove ticking and snow coming down soft and slow past the window. I had her ledger open on the table, not to read the numbers, but to read her handwriting, the loops and slants of a woman who wrote down the truth every single day of her life. My coffee was going cold, and I didn't care. My friend Margot called to check on me, and she asked if I was lonely out there, and I told her the truth. I told her I had never in my life felt so completely, quietly free. What my grandmother left me was never really the $3 million. The money was just the proof. What she left me was the lesson she'd been teaching since I was 8 years old in a cold farmhouse. That you do not have to raise your voice to be powerful. That you do not have to chase the people who underestimate you. That you only have to watch and remember and let them show you who they are before you decide what they get to keep. She knew Marcus before I was willing to. She protected me through a document signed 3 years before I ever knew I'd need protecting. That is what love that watches looks like. So here is what I want to leave with you tonight. If there is someone in your life who laughs at what you've built, who counts your worth in front of you and finds it small, believe them the first time. You don't owe them your future. You don't owe them an argument. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is simply let them finish talking, and then let the truth walk into the room behind you. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments. Would you have read the letter out loud the way I did? Or would you have kept it private and let the silence speak? If you know someone who needs to hear that quiet strength outlasts loud cruelty, share this with them tonight. And if you're new here, subscribe. There's another story waiting for you in the description about a woman everyone wrote off until the moment she stopped letting them. Thank you for being here, all the way to the end. I'll see you very soon.